Then Simone moved. Simone Hayes was everything the family cultivated. Glossy hair, a laugh that ended an invitation, a profile that fit the room. She drifted from her table like a figure cut from the same satin as the light. Darius, who had stood rigidly sweet, did something small and human. He turned. He stepped forward and placed his hand at the small of Simone's back. The shift was tiny, the sort of social jolt that makes people reconsider what they think they know about loyalty. A ripple of laughter, thin and sharp, slid across the crowd. Someone had the decency to cough. Naya watched the in-between of it, the way Darius's jaw softened into something that was not meant for her, the way Simone's eyes flicked to the crowd to register their performance. The quartet stumbled over a phrase and then recovered. The chandeliers glared as if offended. Naya felt the dress tighten against her ribs. If she had been a different kind of woman, she might have laughed, one of those small, surgical laughs that cuts the room down to size. Instead, she let her face become an even plane. She had been trained to manage a variety of losses: inheritance, affection, privacy. But the humiliation of a groom's casual diversion at the center of his wedding was raw in a way boardrooms never were. It was not merely public, it was a statement about her value. She had been placed there, an ornament to the family's transaction, and now that ornament had been set aside mid-ceremony. The laughter grew, not cruel, but gossiping, the sort that warms itself on other people's misfortune. A toastmaster, half in jest and half in the protective mode of social engineers, made a joke to fill the silence. Cameras flashed, eager to catch the fractured tableau. Phones recorded, spinning a new rumor into existence before the last note of the quartet had died. Darius, to be fair, looked momentarily embarrassed, as if he had misread the temperature of the room. Simone smiled with practiced affection, and then, as if pulling a curtain closed, returned to her seat. The room rearranged itself, and the band took up a new forgettable tune. Naya's smile when she offered it was ceremonial, an artifact. Inside, something tightened and then unraveled. They left the ballroom under polite applause and the rustle of silk. Outside, rain began, soft at first, a merciful wash that could have felt like cleansing if Naya had the luxury of believing in symbols. The taxi for the bride was not yet in sight when her mother's breath hitched. It was a strange emergency, the kind that moves in small domestic ways before the larger machinery kicks in. A nurse at the house noticed the pills on the nightstand were untouched, then checked the pill boxes, then called for the doctor. One of the attendants, the kind who appears for people who have everything but not always the time, said the word that tightened everything else. She collapsed. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. No dramatic medical details, no graphic scenes, only the measured statement and then the impossible waiting. Nia sat in the passenger seat of the car and pressed her palms to her dress as if it might keep them from showing the tremor she felt in her wrists. The driver was discreet, trained in the art of the invisible. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fabric softener, a combination that never made any sense. Her mother's room had clinical humidity and the small, stubborn presence of things. A stack of magazines, a pair of slippers by the bed, a folded shawl. The nurse on duty kept talking about probable complications and the doctor about tests. "We won't know until the labs come back," said a man who had the necessary softness of someone who delivered bad news for a living. He did not say the words Nia suspected: probable poisoning, withheld medication. He did not have to. The knowledge had places to hide. In medicine cabinets, in the way schedules were shifted, in the ledger that accounted for everything in neat columns. Within hours, the family produced statements and spokespeople. Elijah Hayes's voice is the kind you imagine when you hear about men who built empires: controlled, measured, everything chosen, and everything profitable. He moved through the hallways with a caretaked calm, stroking the back of Nia's hand in private gestures that felt rehearsed. "We will know the truth," he said to a crowd of muted faces. The press obliged by asking the softer questions. Social feeds replaced the slow, methodical investigation the family had wanted. Rumors, as they do, blossomed. Nia retreated from the public orbit, first under the pretense of grief, and then under the protective hand of Vivian, who lived on the outskirts of the city, in a house that smelled of dust and lemon peel, and things kept because they were useful rather than because they glittered. Vivian had always been the family's exiled conscience, the one who kept a back burner on things the family preferred to have distant. She had been banished once, years ago, for refusing a line in the family's public script. Now she opened her door without the fanfare of the Hayes hospitality. At Vivian's kitchen table, amid chipped mugs and a lamp that threw a small golden pool onto the ledger, Nia learned how complicated truth could be. Vivian moved like someone who had been wounded and then stitched herself together with competence. She offered Nia tea and pulled from a drawer an envelope of old papers and a faded journal. "You always thought the ledger would be enough," Vivian said, and she pushed a battered book toward her. The ledger, Vivian explained, was not merely about balances and shipments. It was a map of decisions that had been made, donations redirected, disposals logged that never happened, charitable lines that only existed on paper. The ledger showed a pattern. Funds meant for community clinics had been shifted into shell accounts. Receipts for medicine inventory had gaps. On their own, each line could be explained. Together, they made a case. Nia read until the words blurred. The handwriting in the ledger was precise. The numbers arranged like small altars. Some entries matched invoices. Others did not. There were dates when a truck listed as disposed had a corresponding check into a numbered account. Vivian added a second pile: photographs, a receipt she'd pried from a forgotten folder, a crumpled note that spoke in the shorthand of guilt. Among the photographs was a picture of a sapphire pendant tucked in the pocket of a man who had once been a manager at Hayes Family Foods. The pendant matched the widow's tear they'd laid on Nia's neck at her wedding. "And the diary?" Nia asked. There was trepidation in her voice. The diary promised to make motives human, and motives were the most dangerous things. Vivian slid a thin book, leather softened by years, across the table. It was the journal of Nia's mother. Small entries, the kind that lived in the space between a woman's appointments and her private thoughts. The writing was not monumental. It was attentive, the sort that documented small betrayals and small mercies. One page, penned in a hand that wavered with time, mentioned a missed dose, a nurse who had promised but had spoken of being overworked, and a line that stopped mid-sentence and then resumed days later. "There are names that keep appearing on the receipts. They are not the charities I asked to help." The diary did not accuse with dramatic flourish. It remembered, it traced. It gave texture to the ledger's cold columns. It built motives out of small actions. a withheld prescription here, an unmade call there. It was the kind of evidence that turned suspicion into story. Nia did not move immediately to vengeance. She had watched what her family did to people who stepped out of their roles, Vivian included. The Hayes apparatus did not simply punish, it rewrote narratives. They poured their resources into public relations, into gentle denials, into the business pages where the world tended to trust numbers more than people. Nia understood that exposure without proof would be absorbed by the family's machine and spat out as rumor. She would need more than diary entries and the soft grief of a woman who had already been erased by her own health. She began to gather evidence the way one might gather a body of water, carefully, building a channel. Calvin was the first to be approached, the one who could point to soft things in the company, inventory shifts, the odd truck route, the names that arrived and left with the business's internal life. Calvin met her at a diner that smelled of coffee and bleach and wore the careful look of a man who had learned to be small within structures that did not reward honesty. "If you think I'm risking my neck for scraps," he said, stirring his coffee until it dulled, "you're wrong. But there are things that keep me up." His voice trembled with a fear more personal than financial. He stopped. The words were too dangerous for the diner. "They've made it hard for decent people to do decent work." Nia learned the pattern empirically. A truck route listed as disposal that instead diverted to a warehouse marked as inventory for a nonprofit that did not exist. Expenditures listed as donation that had been laundered into accounts that paid for holidays, for parties, for the jewelry that sometimes reappeared on the necks of those favored. Calvin's fear was not abstract. It included names, small ones, but names that, when traced, led to a money trail that smelled more of consequence than the clean paper the Hayes machine liked. She took the ledger copies and the diary pages to Andre, who had once been a newspaper man and now ran a modest investigative feed that had more integrity than financial backing. Andre recognized building blocks. He had been hardened into cynicism by the industry, but something in the way Nia held the documents, calm, precise, pulled him out of the cynicism for the first time in years. "You don't let things happen to you," Andre said. "You make them happen." He read with the gravity of someone who understood the mechanics of stories and the appetite of the public for the fall of the rich. "We don't need to destroy people. We need to let the law see what's already there." Their plan grew out of necessity and invention. They would assemble a body of proof that could not be dismissed as grieving impulse. Ledger lines aligned with external receipts. Photographs linked to named accounts. The diary entries paired with witness testimony. They employed Malcolm, a reputable reporter with a network, to ensure that, when the time came, the story would be delivered to the places it could not be bought away. Nia learned to move with the patience of someone who had been constrained all her life. There was method to the quietness that grew in her. She made lists, not of vengeance, but of questions. She cataloged receipts and triangulated them with shipping manifests and bank records. She watched the family from the outside, noting gestures and alliances. Simone's laughter still sharp. Elijah's controlled gaze that weighed people as currency. Darius's tendency to fold into the family's pattern when public attention pressed. The sapphire necklace became a small obsession, an object that could be proof of transfer and motive all at once. Vivian produced a story about a man who had come to the factory years ago with a grateful look and a pendant peeking at his chest. A piece of jewelry could be dismissed as fashion. On the ledger lines, jewelry payments correspond to shifts in inventory labeling. It was circumstantial, but the current of coincidence was strong. Nia's life condensed into these small excavations. She moved between Vivian's house and the city, collecting what the family had mislaid. She visited the factory floor, where the smell of wheat and flour had a sort of honest sting. Workers who had been silenced by fear now spoke in half sentences to her, the way birds sing only when they think no one is listening. She recorded them with permission, not for spectacle, but for record. There were setbacks. Calvin laughed from the edge of a wound one night when Nia proposed a plan that required him to risk everything. "You want me to be a martyr?" he asked. He was sincere in his fear. Later, he would break for fewer reasons than she had hoped, and she would learn the limits of what compromised people can do. Meanwhile, the family's PR machine churned. Public statements were released. Foundations wrote check after check to causes with names as clean as white linens. The press, at first indulgent, showed the family the courtesy of the doubt they buy. It is astonishing, the degree to which the public buys the good story when it is dressed in polished cashmere. Nia learned that truth is not merely revealed. It must be made visible, and it must be hard to spin. The plan she and Andre cooked was surgical rather than vengeful. It had the economy of someone who understood leverage. Public spectacle aligned with incontrovertible documents. The gala, a shiny event held in the city's most indiscriminately glittering hall, would be the stage. She would not crash it with a white dress and a fury. She would present evidence in a way that required confession or forced corroboration. The weeks leading to the gala were a montage of meetings and small betrayals. Darius volunteered for travel, suddenly unavailable for the rehearsals his family insisted upon. Simone, who had shown a panic in private that the public could not imagine, veered between bravado and thin nerves. Elijah, always the iceberg, continued to sign his name and glide through society dinners, his face practice perfect. Nia felt like a seamstress fitting a hidden panel into a dress. It had to be perfect lest the entire couture bargain show seams. She and Andre rehearsed the disclosures like actors with something to prove. Malcolm prepared to document the scene with a team that had the discretion of professionals who understood that once a story escapes the chamber of private power, it is hard to quiet. On the night of the gala, the hall was more luminous than memory. The chandeliers gleamed like the teeth of a god amused. People wore their reputations like armor, glittering, shiny, impenetrable until the light caught a crack. Nia arrived not as a spectacle, but a quiet presence. She wore darker clothes now, no white, because there was a fatigue in being a symbol when she wanted to be possible proof. Vivian had insisted she leave her jewelry at home. In the hollow after the reveal, she felt something that was not satisfaction, but a curious, complicated ease. The ledger's lines had been read into the light, and the diary had been given voice. Justice is not simple. It is administrative. It is legal. It is slow. It is also profound in the small ways it allows people to be seen as themselves again, not only as objects for other people's strategies. Months moved like a patient narrative. The Hayes name did not fall all at once. It frayed in a way that required patience to watch. There were hearings and depositions. Simone's statements shifted as lawyers did their work. Calvin testified with the kind of regret that takes the shape of small facts. Malcolm's piece had been careful. He did not hunt for gore. He presented the documents and the stories. public opinion, always hungry for a moral geometry, arranged itself into factions. Some saw Naya as a righteous avenger. Others deemed her culpable in the very spectacle they condemned. The machine of opinion is never satisfied with nuance. And then, slowly, there was a new chapter that had nothing to do with spectacle: restoration. 6 months after the gala, with the factory under new oversight and a court-appointed manager in place, Naya took the position she had been trained for, in practice, though never in name. The board, some of its members new, and some survivors of the old guard, accepted her proposal to reopen a wing of the company as a transparent operation. It was not revenge. It was a different currency. Naya's wanted in her work to create a place that would not commodify suffering into a marketing line. She wanted the little clinics the ledger had promised to exist in memory, to exist truly now. The foundation, named for her mother, was part of that plan. It did not cure everything. It could not undo the years of quiet compromise, nor restore a woman lost to what the diary had remembered as days that blurred. But it could build a public care that could not be privatized for profit. Naya staffed it with people who had lived the consequences of the company's prior decisions. She worked itself like a kind of tenderness. Andre was there through this period, not simply as a partner in the public work, but as someone who had learned to see Naya, not as a case, but as a person. There had been a slow thaw between them, long conversations over coffee, an awkward lunch that turned into a project a year later, a hand that slid toward another in a moment of quiet. Their relationship was not the sort that swept the narrative into romantic cliché. Instead, it grew out of shared work and mutual respect, small gestures of care that built into a companionable rhythm. Andre was not a knight in the dramatic sense. He was someone who had seen how Naya handled grief and strategy and wanted to stand beside her for that life. When the city tried to brand her as the avenging daughter or the woman who ruined a dynasty, she resisted the easy labels. She did not relish public destruction. She had only wanted the truth. Truth, she found, had a cost. That cost did not fall only on those who had conspired to divert funds. It fell also on families, on relationships, on people who had been mosaics of complicity and fear. Justice returned a measure of order, but nothing like the restoration of untouched innocence. There was no back to go to. She had to make a new forward. Half a year into her new role, with the factory humming and the foundation running small clinics in neighborhoods that had once been left with empty shelves, a quiet invitation arrived. It was not a gala. It was a small gathering in a renovated community hall, the kind of place where children can learn music and an old piano waits in the corner. There were no chandeliers, only strings of bulbs that cast a friendly glow. Nia arrived not as a bride, but as someone who had earned the right to the simplicity of a decision. Andre stood across the floor. He had a look that was at once cautious and tender, the two feelings that had characterized their courtship. There were no cameras planted to catch the moment. There was only music, kind and unassuming, and people who had worked with Nia through the year. Therapists, former factory workers, neighbors who had benefited from the clinics. The crowd was small and sincere in a way that made champagne meaningless. When the music slowed, Andre reached for her hand. He did not take her into a spectacle. He took her into an ordinary dance, the kind that people take when they want to be closest to someone with whom life has been reorganized. Nia felt the press of his palms, the softness of his shoulder, the steadiness of someone who looked at her not as a title, but as a companion. The bulbs above them hummed like attentive cicadas. It was, to her surprise, the most emotional wedding dance she had ever experienced. Not because the choreography was perfect or because the moment was staged to maximize social capital. It was because it was chosen. The difference between that hold and the one at her earlier wedding was not ceremony, but consent. In the span of a decade, she had moved from being a public exhibit to a person with boundaries and choices. The dance marked not only a love story between two people, but a transformation, the reclamation of agency. For some, the idea that Nia found love with Andre would feel tidy. For others, the image of her dancing in a modest room with bulbs above and people who had seen the worst and stayed would seem almost an anticlimax. But life is made of small, deliberate choices. That night, she allowed herself to be held without armor. She let the decade of loss fold into the decade of healing, and the movement between them had a gravity that made applause unnecessary. The legal processes continued in the background: hearings, settlements, transfers of assets. The narrative of the Hayes Empire became a court record and a cautionary tale. Simone faced consequences that were complicated and not fully satisfying to any side. Elijah retreated into a life that required new adjustments. Naya did not gloat. She felt the ambivalence of someone who had won and yet known the price. There were nights when the memory of the dress tightened around her like regret for a life that had been too long misdirected into performance. When she walked the factory floor weeks later, the machines hummed like a chorus in which every instrument had been tuned to a different standard. Workers greeted her without the wary politeness that comes from obligation. There were new faces and old faces and small conversations that did not have to pass through the filter of public favor. The Foundation's clinics had offered a measure of restitution. Children now received checkups that had been promised on days when the ledger lied. The work was a slow justice, granular and patient. Naya found meaning in it the way one discovers a path through persistent rain, by putting one foot in front of another. And still, sometimes, she found herself thinking about the choreography of power. She thought of the ledger and the diary as twin testimonies, one of numbers, one of moments. She understood then that truth lived in both. Documents can make a case, diaries make the case human. Justice needed both to do its work. Months later, in an interview arranged by a journalist who had once been skeptical and now was respectful, Naya was asked if she felt vindicated. She did not choose the easy rhetoric. She said instead that the truth had been necessary but costly. She mentioned that she had learned to live with the cost. "There's a difference between justice and revenge," she said slowly. "I wanted accountability. I wanted people to be safe. I did not set out to destroy a family. I set out to make sure that mothers could get their medication on time and that clinics wouldn't be paper projects. That, to me, is worth the cost." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had traded spectacle for work. It carried also the unresolved notes of grief, regret that certain relationships could not be mended, doubt about whether the glare of public scrutiny was always a worthy medicine. She had never wanted to be a symbol, and yet she had been forced into that role by the nature of exposure. She accepted the paradox because the alternative was quiet complicity. In the quiet that followed the storm, Naya learned to see the world in smaller measures. She allowed herself to fall in love in the daytime and to be human in public. She learned that courage takes many forms: the courage to confront a family, the courage to listen to a worker, the courage to accept a hand in a dance that meant partnership and not possession. Years might file the edges of the story. Court records yellowed, news cycles closed, but the ledger and the diary remained as inert and stubborn as facts. The foundation continued to do its labor. The factory persisted with new oversight, and people who had once been silenced found their voices. Nia continued to walk her path, not as an avenger, but as a steward, someone who had been given a role by accident and then by choice. Her wedding dance with Andre in that small bell-lit room became less of a headline and more of a private language between two people who had seen the scaffolding of a family fall and then helped to build something that might be better and more honest. The decade that had begun with a dress and a ledger and a humiliated heart ended in its own way on a simple note, a hand in a hand, a slow song, the steady company of someone who had chosen to stay. What Nia had not done was annihilate the past. She had not tried to erase the people who had hurt her. Instead, she had used the law and the light of accountability to clear space for repair. She had taken a jewel that once meant commodified grief and turned its memory into a reason to care for others. There was an ambivalence that lingered, an intellectual unease about how far exposure could go and what it costs when families unravel. Nia did not have an answer that could satisfy every conscience. She had a life that bore the marks of consequence and the quiet joy of a small chosen companionship. She had also a foundation in her mother's name and a factory that hums on a schedule that put people before profit. If the story demanded a moral, it was mixed. Truth matters, but truth is not without cost. Justice is necessary, but so is the restraint to ensure justice does not become a spectacle of revenge. Nia, in the end, practiced the dull work of rebuilding, and in that labor, she found a kind of love that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the tenacity of ordinary human fidelity. Thank you for staying with Nia through this decade of quiet reclamation and public reckoning. What do you think of the choices she made? Was her path toward exposure and institutional repair justified, or did she cross a line where personal cost outweighed public gain? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and click the suggested story on your screen for another deep dive into a life that changed the way its world operated. Nia rose before the light and moved through the house as if through a chapel. There were small rituals that steadied her, the kettle's first hiss, the slow peeling of an orange at the kitchen table, the ledger that sat now on a narrow shelf between a stack of brochures from the foundation and a photograph of her mother in a dress she liked. Andre was still asleep when she left. His hand had found the small, familiar place at the edge of the blanket where her fingers fit, and she smoothed the sheet without waking him. The factory was a short walk at that hour, streets empty, air cool enough to carry the smell of oil and the metallic tang of early machinery. What Nia had not done was annihilate the past. She had not tried to erase the people who had hurt her. Instead, she had used the law and the light of accountability to clear space for repair. She had taken a jewel that once meant commodified grief and turned its memory into a reason to care for others. There was an ambivalence that lingered, an intellectual unease about how far exposure could go and what it costs when families unravel. Nia did not have an answer that could satisfy every conscience. She had a life that bore the marks of consequence and the quiet joy of a small, chosen companionship. She had also a foundation in her mother's name and a factory that hums on a schedule that put people before profit. If the story demanded a moral, it was mixed. Truth matters, but truth is not without cost. Justice is necessary, but so is the restraint to ensure justice does not become a spectacle of revenge. Nia, in the end, practiced the dull work of rebuilding, and in that labor, she found a kind of love that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the tenacity of ordinary human fidelity. Thank you for staying with Nia through this decade of quiet reclamation and public reckoning. What do you think of the choices she made? Was her path toward exposure and institutional repair justified, or did she cross a line where personal cost outweighed public gain? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and click the suggested story on your screen for another deep dive into a life that changed the way its world operated. Nia rose before the light and moved through the house as if through a chapel. There were small rituals that steadied her: the kettle's first hiss, the slow peeling of an orange at the kitchen table, the ledger that sat now on a narrow shelf between a stack of brochures from the foundation and a photograph of her mother in a dress she liked. Andre was still asleep when she left. His hand had found the small, familiar place at the edge of the blanket where her fingers fit, and she smoothed the sheet without waking him. The factory was a short walk at that hour, streets empty, air cool enough to carry the smell of oil and the metallic tang of early machinery. She liked the cadence of the place in the morning when the hum was low and workers moved like a tide before the tide rose. She paused at the gate, listening to a foreman call the roll in a voice that had softened in the years since the scandal. People she had once watched from a courtroom gallery now nodded with a kind of private acknowledgement. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered the quick, unadorned smile that had nothing to do with cameras. Inside, the new oversight board kept its meetings in a room with a window that opened onto the shop floor. They had learned to balance auditing with listening. Compliance took shape not only as a list of checks, but as regular conversations with line workers about their lives, medicine schedules, school fees, the little structural fixes that kept a family afloat. Nia sat in on one of these meetings when she had to, less to assert authority than to be present, and she listened more than she spoke. She watched how a worker named Tomas described a delay in the supply chain and how a leaner solution suggested by a young technician cut the downtime and the tempers. It felt to her like a kind of repair that was both practical and moral. She had expected, perhaps vainly, that her role would harden into an instructive clarity. Wrong done, wrong answered, order restored. But life refused that simplicity. New problems arose with the old ones: suppliers who skirted rules, local officials who offered favors in exchange for old loyalties, community members who believed they had been unjustly judged years before. There were days she wondered whether she had become merely another instrument of an institutional rhythm. Checks, reports, press statements, rather than a person who could lean toward mercy. On one of those days, Leela came to the office. Leela had once worked as an intern for Nia's foundation and arrived now with a tidiness of conviction that both delighted and unsettled her mentor. She carried a satchel of documents and an intensity that made Nia think of the younger version of herself, the one who had kept the ledger in a grocery bag and slept with it under her pajamas. "There's something you should see," Leela said without preamble. She spread photographs on the table. A plant north of the city, banners in the courtyard, men in 2 uniforms, both speaking the same tongue of negligence. The images were not dramatic: no blotted pens, no ruined boxes, only small details: a rusted railing, a clinic with a locked door sign, a payroll ledger with a name or two misaligned. Leela's hands moved as she spoke, assembling suspicion like a builder fitting bricks. "This could be a pattern," she said. "It might be nothing, or it might be what we thought we'd closed, only shifted." Nia looked at the photographs and then at Leela. She felt a familiar flare of something that had once driven her, exposure as remedy. Yet she also felt the other thing, the one that had grown with years of seeing fragile human lives rearranged by headlines. "We have to verify everything," she said. "We have to ask people quietly, with respect, and we have to remember why we act. Are we seeking to protect, or are we seeking to punish?" Lila sat back and studied Naya as if measuring the arc of her life for a lesson. "Protect," she said after a pause, "but I don't know how to separate the two. Sometimes it feels like one word." They arranged an inquiry less like an ambush than a patient unspooling. Visits, interviews, a quiet conversation with the clinic's nurse who admitted that the lock was an act of fear. Supplies had been stolen. The staff had felt unsafe reporting it. There were no neat villains at first glance, only a mesh of neglect, fear, and insufficient oversight. It was the kind of case that made Naya feel oddly less like an avenger and more like a steward of the slow fix. That afternoon, after the interviews, she took a bus to a neighborhood where she had once held a public forum. The center smelled of lemon cleaner and fried food, and a group of women were playing cards under a fan that did not always move. A flyer on the wall announced a single line: "Community conversation, tell your story." She sat at the back and watched people come in, carrying histories like bundles. Rosa entered after most had already begun to talk. She was younger than Naya had expected by a decade, her hair in a tight coil, her face steady with a fatigue that did not bother to disguise itself. When she spoke, she did so without preamble, as if she had been rehearsing in private for a long time. "My father worked at the old factory," she said. "He died when I was 9. He had chest problems, breathing, and medicines that came late. At his funeral, my uncle said it was our misfortune, but we never learned why it happened. No one came and explained." The room shifted. A silence arrived like a tide. People nodded. Naya felt the weight of years pressing into that small space. She thought of her ledger and the list of delayed shipments that had once been abstract numbers and were now, to Rosa, a cause of a private wound. Rosa continued, "I read about what happened. I read the papers that said the family was punished, that the company was fined. But I still have a question. Did anyone ever say sorry to us? Not just in court, not a statement, a person to us, looking at what they did." Rosa's question landed between the rows like a reckoning. Naya understood the grammar of it. Not only accountability, but acknowledgement. Her years of public work had taught her that the law could demand restitution and that human acknowledgement often required a different courage. When the session ended, Rosa stayed behind. Naya walked to her, and the two women sat under the slow-moving fan. They spoke for an hour about fathers who left tools at the foot of beds, about mothers who stretched a week's medicine into 2, about how a child's teeth were lost from a malnutrition that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with neglect. Rosa did not ask for symbolic phrases. She asked for something practical. Help for her sister's child who needed a specialist appointment and could not afford it. Naya offered what she could without ceremony: a phone number, a foundation fund already earmarked for urgent care, a promise to look personally into a scholarship for the niece. It was a small convening of resources, and Rosa accepted it with a look that seemed to measure whether this was charity or reparative action. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what to call this." "Call it a beginning," Naya said. That phrase, "call it a beginning," had become something of a private liturgy for Naya. She had used it when the factory reopened lines that had been closed, when the foundation launched a mentorship program for former employees, when she and Andre planted trees along the riverbank where a dumping had once been. Beginnings, she had learned, required tending. On her way home that night, she found a letter slipped under the door. The envelope bore a name she had not expected to see, the patriarch of the family whose actions had once been the headline of her life. There was no lawyer's stamp, no demand, only a brief handwritten page that carried an old man's hand shaking in the ink. "I cannot undo what was done," it read. "I can only tell you that what I did then was wrong. If you will, speak to my son. He carries what I cannot carry and perhaps can carry it better. I am tired." Naya pressed the paper to her lips as if to taste the humility that had for so long been absent from that house. She imagined the man who had written it, older now, diminished, perhaps finally, painfully learning what confessions cost. She also thought of the years of silence and the many small lives that silence had harmed. The next morning, she put the letter in a folder beside the ledger. She called Andre over breakfast and read the lines to him. He listened with the patient gravity that had steadied her through protests, trials, and the small, unglamorous work of running a foundation. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She thought of Leela and her photographs, of Rosa and her sister's child, of the ledger that had once been an instrument of accusation and now lay open as a map of where to send help. "I want to meet him," she said finally. "Not to create a spectacle, to see whether there is the possibility of some small, practical repair. To ask whether his son will help fund the clinic that locked its door." Andre reached across the table and took her hand. "Then do it the way you always do," he said, "with the ledger and with listening." So she prepared notes, a plan for the conversation that would not be a judicial transcript, but an honest attempt at restitution. She did not think that a meeting would cancel the past. She did not expect contrition to unmake broken lives. But she believed in the possibility of localized justice. A clinic reopened, a scholarship created, a fund for medicines that did not require court orders to access. When she walked into the old man's parlor, she saw, in the folding of his hands, the same things she had seen in Rosa: fatigue and the need for name. The meeting that followed was not dramatic. There were long pauses, an exchange of hows and whys rather than indictments. The man's son arrived later. He was younger than Naya had expected and careful in his words. He did not deny the harm. He did not offer the kinds of absolutions that headline writers crave. He offered instead a proposal, a modest allocation of funds to underwrite the clinic, a willingness to sit with a community advisory board for a year, and a plan to restructure a contract so that suppliers would be vetted independently. Nia listened. She asked questions. She remembered the ledger and the years of toil that had turned list into consequence. She thought of Rosa's sister waiting for a specialist's call. She thought of Lila bringing photographs that threatened to reopen old wounds. In the end, she did not sign anything on that first day. She did, however, agree to a joint meeting at the clinic. No cameras, no press release. With workers, with community representatives, with the man's son, and with an independent auditor. It was a small agreement, a deliberate step, measured more by care than by headlines. Walking out into the late sun, Nia felt the fragile sensation of balance, accountability tethered to the practicalities of repair. It did not erase the past, but it offered a shape for the future, one in which wrongs were met not only with courts, but with concrete remediations that eased the daily burdens of the harmed. That night, she and Andre sat on the porch with 2 mugs atween them. The trees by the river made a slow applause in the wind. She told him about the meeting and about Rose's request and about Lilith photographs, and he listened with the even breath of someone who had chosen fidelity over spectacle. "It feels like walking on a line," she said. "Attendance to truth on one side, attendance to mercy on the other. I am not sure which foot I put forward first." "You do both," Andre replied. "You listen and you act. You do the dull things that actually help." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. There was still so much to do. Another audit, a meeting with a policymaker who might finally fund rural clinics, the slow administrative work that would not make a headline. There were also small human things: Rose's niece to call, a tree to plant at the clinic, a scholarship application to approve.